CIA interrogations of CIA detainees were absolutely brutal, far worse than the CIA represented them to policymakers and others.
This particular release, in my judgment, serves no purpose whatsoever other than to endanger Americans around the world.
I know from personal experience that the abuse of prisoners will produce more bad than good intelligence.
Now, you've just heard a sampling of some of the dialogue from Senate lawmakers from both sides of the aisle sounding off about the CIA torture report that was recently released by the Senate Intelligence Committee. Now, the report in its scathing, it sheds a grim light on the torture tactics carried out against detainees under the prior administration. Now, some of those tactics include everything from rectal feeding, confinement boxes, cold water dousings, waterboardings, beatings, threats, stress positions, sleep deprivations that went on for days. Now, former Vice President Dick Cheney, he went on Meet the Press this past Sunday, where he unequivocally defended the tactics used by both the CIA, and he also refused to state whether or not he believed that in fact amounted to torture.
Does that meet the definition of torture in your mind?
In my mind, I've told you what meets the definition of torture. It's what 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters did to 3,000 Americans on 9/11. What was done here apparently certainly was not one of the techniques that was approved. I believe it was done for medical reasons. We got the authorization from the president and authorization from the Justice Department to go forward to the program. It worked. It worked now for 13 years. We've avoided another mass casualty attack against the United States. We did capture bin Laden. We did capture an awful lot of the senior guys of al-Qaeda who were responsible for that attack on 9/11. I'd do it again in a minute.
Now, while the CIA does support the use of enhanced interrogation tactics, or EITs, that have been approved, CIA Director John Brennan did state that some of those tactics used on detainees were in fact not authorized.
In a limited number of cases, agency officers used interrogation techniques that had not been authorized, were abhorrent, and rightly should be repudiated by all. And we fell short when it came to holding some officers accountable for their mistakes. It is vitally important to recognize, however, that the overwhelming majority of officers involved in the program at CIA carried out their responsibilities faithfully and in accordance with the legal and policy guidance they were provided.
In a letter to the editor in the Times, Donald Gregg, a former longtime CIA employee, wrote, Mr. Brennan's remarks raised the question of why the CIA was ordered to do these things in the first place. Went on to say that during my career, including service in wartime Vietnam, the agency worked against torture, and I personally saw repeated evidence that humane interrogation produced far better results than torture, which sowed only confusion, shattered lives, and bitter feelings. And I now would like to welcome Donald Gregg here to the program. Mr. Gregg, a former CIA employee and former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, awarded the Distinguished Intelligence Medal and served as National Security Advisor to then Vice President Bush from 1982 to 1989. Thank you so much for a few minutes, and obviously thank you for your service as well. As this dialogue played out and the answer about where the line was and who shall decide, and whether or not after 9/11 we should make these trade-offs. What did you think?
I think that some people lost faith in our ability to deal with a crisis that they had let happen by our traditional methods, and they authorized things that are basically alien to our national culture. I've seen torture in a number of places at a number of times. Friends of mine have been tortured, one to death. One resisted it from the Iranians. I've seen our Vietnamese allies use it, and I would go to them and get people who would not say a word to them under torture, and we would treat them warmly, and they would tell us everything. In Korea, in South Korea, the Korean CIA was torturing people when I was chief of station there. I protested it. The KCIA chief was removed, and his replacement, his first action was a prohibition against torture. So I'm against it, and I think we do ourselves a tremendous amount of harm, and we do our allies a lot of harm when we authorize it. I have friends in Finland who live right next to Russia. A Finnish friend of mine saw my letter and he said, that's wonderful. He said, you have done so much harm to yourselves by what you have done. And I wrote an article in the New York Times 10 years ago when Abu Ghraib first surfaced, and he said, I put it up on the internet in Finland just to remind people that, this is the kind of thing we should not be doing.
One of the things that's confused me about this is not just who shall decide, but who's decided. I mean, when you go through the report, we outsourced to two shrinks who'd never done an interrogation. Forget they don't speak Farsi. They don't know anything about Al-Qaeda. And we're paying them $81 million of taxpayer money with a contract for, pardon my, two yahoos who don't even know the first thing about it. And we're letting them figure out where the line is? I mean, you spent a lot of years in government service, a lot of years at the CIA. How do we get to the point where we're outsourcing to people who I don't think have the authority to make these decisions, and then we have to defend it?
Well, we get into that business when we're asked to do things which is basically not what we signed up to do. We did not sign up to be jail keepers and interrogators. We were asked by JFK to murder Castro, and we weren't very good at assassinating. I was involved in the hearings in 1975, Church Committee, and we made 8 attempts to get Castro and failed in all of them. So we're not very good assassins, or we weren't, and we're lousy torturers. And I'm glad to say that's true in both cases. And it's just, I used to think that the best thing I had going for me as a CIA officer was the fact that I was an American, and the fact that we did not torture our people. Everybody knew the Soviets did. And there was a huge difference. I now have a very close friend who's dual citizenship. She's an Arabic specialist, and when she goes into the Middle East, the closest guarded secret she has is that she's American, and she goes by her French citizenship. And we've done that to ourselves, and I think we need to stop it. I hope that this will become an issue in the election. I think Obama knows that we need an effective CIA, so he's not throwing the whole agency under the bus. He trusts Brennan. And I thought Brennan tried to do a good job the other day. And when he said it is unknowable whether or not these EITs really led us to capture Osama bin Laden, and I think that's a pretty honorable statement.
Who should make the call? Because you have reports, this post 9/11, that the FBI that was there on scene say, time out, we're not doing this. Then certain elements of the CIA didn't want to go along, but certain others did. You had the vice president's office who kind of became the tiebreaker, if you will. Don't we have a protocol as to who decides what we do and don't do with detainees?
CIA works for the executive branch. And President George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, I think, felt very much endangered after 9/11 took place.
Yep.
And so they ordered CIA to get into this business. And when the president orders you to do something, unless you resign on principle, you do your damnedest to do it. And so the line had already been drawn. And he had, I think, a very weak Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, and a guy named John Yoo, who wrote reports saying, oh, none of these things really amount to torture. And so they encouraged.
No, it's crazy when you read the reports and they're like, well, don't let Powell know, he'll blow his stack. Like, we got to keep it from members of not just the administration, but of the cabinet here as to what we're doing because. Now, how about the next step? I know this is espionage, and I'm not naive, okay? So there are things that should be secret, but you had people who testified to Congress one thing when something else was going on. What level of both transparency or at least truthfulness has to happen when you have oversight committees? What are they allowed to lie about, and what aren't they about what we're doing?
Well, transparency and espionage are self-contradictory. I think the agency has a pretty good record in terms of dealing with Dianne Feinstein and the oversight committees. But Dick Helms, who went to my college, lied to Congress at one point because the president had told him to do something, and he wasn't supposed to admit that had happened. And so he lied to Congress. And that's the position that intelligence officers are sometimes put in terms of plausible deniability. And I think we're gradually moving away from that. But I think that we'll make it easier on ourselves and we'll operate more effectively as a country if we don't assign these tasks that are alien to what we want to be.
These guys in an impossible situation. I know you want to jump in.
I have two questions. There's been some intimation that the executive branch signed off on some actions, but that the interrogators went further than was originally signed off on. From your knowledge of the CIA institution, is that the kind of thing that would happen, or would people generally follow the rules that they've been given to the letter?
They would follow the rules to the letter, but cruelty is contagious. There have been a lot of studies on that. There was tremendous pressure to get results, particularly when they got their hands on some of the people who supposedly were responsible for 9/11. And there was huge pressure. And I think there is where some of the rules were broken, as Director Brennan indicated.
And I'm just curious, there's been some calls for those who knew or were involved in this to be prosecuted. Do you agree?
You know, I think that's be terribly difficult. I think the president has made the difficult but realistic decision that what we need to do is say we tortured people, it was wrong to do it, it didn't help, and we're not going to do it from here on. I think if you get into trying people, it then accentuates the divisions that already exist in Congress. And I think probably the best we can do is sort of hold our nose and say we did wrong, we're stopping it, but let's move on. We need an effective CIA. It is an effective organization. They were under real pressure in that case. Let's help them do what is natural to them.
Quick question, Ambassador. One of the things that a lot of us are having trouble with is the political nature of this report, done by a Democrat, didn't interview any of the people involved, comes out with this damning report. And the one big issue that a lot of us citizens want to know is, did anything occur here that could have provided information to help us get Osama bin Laden? Former director Hayden says it did. He says we found out who the courier was that was critical in finding him, and yet others say absolutely not, or you can't tell. How do we as citizens know whether this had any positive impact on our intelligence?
I think you have to go back to Brennan's statement. It's unknowable. There's a fascinating film called Zero Dark 30 that goes into that. And I just saw on television today the SEAL who's now saying, I'm the one who potted Osama bin Laden. He said, yeah, absolutely. We got through torture of Sheikh Mohammed, the name of this courier who led us to Osama bin Laden. There are other people who say that's not the case, that this information was gotten before torture was applied. So it's one of those things. It's very difficult to reconstruct what is done covertly under great pressure.
And I could go on all hour with you. I just have one final question. You mentioned you were with the church committee. And for folks who don't know, and if you go back to lessons learned that we put real changes in the mid-'70s after it, that was more domestic, where we crossed certain lines. But wasn't the big lesson from that even with the best of intentions or whatever else, if you have unchecked power, it always leads to abuse? It's just human nature. You have to have checks and balances.
Yes, I think that's true, and there are also, I think, you know, secret intelligence agency is an anomaly in a free society. You work for the president,
yep,
and we elect very different presidents. On my first trip to North Korea, the first two questions I was asked was, why is George W. Bush so different from his father? And the second question was, how do you function effectively as a country when you elect presidents that have nothing to do with their predecessors? And I said, well, that's the way democracy works. If the president doesn't behave the way the majority of the people want him to, we elect somebody else. And the North Koreans said that makes it very difficult for countries like us to keep up with you. And there's a point to that.
Well, I think we'd all agree we'll take ours over North Korea any day here. Donald, a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it, and I definitely would love to have you back if you would.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And as we go out, we're going to take a look at our photo of the day here. You're looking at a picture of a flower memorial taken outside of the cafe in Sydney, Australia. That where a gunman held customers hostage for 16 hours, and tragically 3 people were killed, including that gunman. All right, we come back. Andrew's got a special report for us. Tomorrow, major day in New York, Decision Day. We find out how many new casinos will come to the state, and if any will be in the Catskills or the Hudson Valley. We'll take a look back at some of the epic resort history when it comes to that, and you won't believe what those legendary hotels actually look like today. We'll show you.